Joining me now for another edition of the Knicks Film School pregame show with the Knicks welcoming in Luka Doncic, Kyrie Irving, and the Dallas Mavericks to the Garden on Thursday to play whoever is able to walk on the Knicks in this matchup on national television. We welcome in a friend of the Blue Wire podcast family from Pod Maverick. It's Mr. Kirk Henderson. Kirk, how you doing, man?
Not bad. Thanks for having me today.
I appreciate you making the time, and I know last night was a late night in Brooklyn for you and the Mavericks, and you know they got the win. It's 2 straight W's. They do find themselves in the 8th seed at the moment. So to the Knicks fan that's on the obviously outside looking in at what's going on in Dallas, please tell us off the top, how are the vibes in Dallas at the moment?
Weird. It's been really an injury-plagued season. You know, nowhere near as bad as somebody like the Grizzlies or something like that. But Kyrie Irving, in a surprise to precisely no one or the 16-year-old super fans that he seems to garner, has only played about 60% of the games. And then he and Luka's also missed about 8 games due to various injuries. And then other guys that they've relied on, just, you know, in past seasons, a guy by the name of Maxi Kleber, their other German guy. He is dislocated his toe and missed 30 games. And so they've been rolling out kind of some odd lineups there. So the vibes are mixed because they started the season 8-2 and have essentially played 500 basketball since, which compared to last season is actually pretty good. So big picture, they're 28-23, which is much better than they were at this point last year because they beat the Knicks in that 60-point ridiculous game that Luka had, and then they precisely died. Like that was the last gasp of the 2022-23 Dallas Mavericks.
The 2 Mavericks-Knicks games last year are actually very important to the timeline of the Knicks trajectory. The game at the Garden last year in early December was the game we all thought that was going to be Tom Thibodeau's last as Knicks head coach, and it was a matinee that I'm sure you remember. Tim Hardaway Jr. went off in the third quarter. They erased a 19-point deficit, and the whispers amongst the Garden faithful were that if he loses another one, which is the next day against Donovan Mitchell that they didn't trade for, and the Cavaliers, that Monday would be pink slip day. They ended up winning that Monday game. They changed the rotation the next day, and the rest is kind of history for the Knicks. And like these expectations have now been put on this season, and you know last year was a fun run, and then you know what's going on with the Knicks this year has been pretty cool. But I'm actually very curious the expectations that the Mavericks had coming into the season, or at least Mavericks fans had coming into the season, especially with, like you said, the cliff that it seemed to fall off of, even with the Kyrie Irving trade.
Mavericks fan expectations are absolutely ludicrous.
Okay.
And that's going to happen because, so when we go back to the 21-22 season, the year they made the Western Conference Finals, Tim Hardaway got hurt on January 31st, and then the Mavericks proceeded to win 70% of their games the rest of the year and go to the Western Conference Finals. They played like a 6.5, 7.5 man rotation. Thibs would have been just delighted at the amount of minutes that all the players on the Mavericks played. They wore Reggie Bullock down to a like dead eraser. He just can't even play basketball anymore. They rolled out so many minutes for him. And so because of that run, a lot of Mavericks fans are like, well, why don't we win 70% of the games all the time? And, you know, it's particularly hard to do when you're very dumb, and I know we're going to get this later, when you're very dumb franchise just lets Jalen Brunson walk. The timeline of that, you know, is I think we should cover it again because it's very funny in hindsight, very maddening. Like he wanted an extension. How do you not give him an extension even at how he was playing?
Do you want to talk about it now? We can.
Could you imagine if Jalen Brunson was playing on a 4 for 55 deal right now? He'd be in year 2 or 3 of that. Maybe it doesn't matter.
Year 3, year 3.
The steal of steals of steals. It's so ridiculous. But so we'll circle back to Brunson. But so the expectations coming in 23 were pretty high, even though there was no reason for them to be. Their key offseason acquisition was JaVale McGee, who is the worst. Can't handle JaVale. Then last year they just slowly died because they only had 2 guys who could dribble. I mean, Frank Ntilikina, I know Knicks fans, there's a few Knicks fans that still really love him. He was earnest to goodness, like sometimes the second string point guard due to injuries. That can't be a thing. He can only dribble in a straight line. And so the Mavericks just sort of wore themselves down to a nub. And then I get a little annoyed with the tanking discussion because Portland tanked for like 6 straight years, and yet Damian Lillard is still regarded as like one of the best players of all time. Luka was forced to tank by his organization, and this is a travesty to the game. And so the Mavericks, they go out and tank. They ended up with Derek Lively and Olivier Maxence Prosper draft picks, and then they start this year. And I think the initial expectations. Sorry, that's a long way of answering your question. The initial expectations were, let's just make the playoffs. And then they started 8-2, and they just looked good. They did. They looked great. And then since then, the injuries have piled up, and it's become kind of a war of attrition. This close to the before the All-Star break is going to be very important, but it looked like they might go into the All-Star break under 500. That's now impossible, even if they lose to the Knicks in the next 3 games after that. So for me, it's a step in the right direction because I just kind of want to get there. I would take, Luka in a closeout game over most players that are kind of in that mix, maybe one exception being Steph Curry. So I would say the vibes are the expectations are sort of, let's just get to the playoffs and see what can happen.
So lots to unpack there. Let me start with just 20-21 since the 8-2 start and how expectations, I guess, have kind of changed after the injury started. My follow-up would be, the trade deadline is less than 24 hours and 20 minutes from when we're recording at the moment. What's the move that Mavericks fans want, that it's not just waiting for guys to come back, it's also adding? Like, who's the name that seems to get mentioned a ton amongst Mavericks fans?
Well, there's a desperate hope for PJ Washington from the Charlotte Hornets, but Mark Stein said that's basically a no-go because they're demanding a first-round pick. The Mavericks only have one they can move, and if they do that, then they're kind of screwed for the rest of Luka's contract. So I think that's kind of out. I've heard and read, a little bit about perhaps a Grant Williams for Bucks big man, crazy eyes, punched Nero.
Bobby Portis.
Yeah, Bobby Portis. Sorry. A swap there, which would be like, I like it for the short term, but it's actually kind of catastrophic if you think about what that means, because that's the first young player the Mavericks have signed to a free agent deal, and then they would trade him 50 games in. Like, bad news there.
Bad news, but just a quick follow up. Like, he's been pretty bad this year too, right?
Oh, Grant Williams might be the worst active NBA player to like that's talented and is getting minutes other than Andrew Wiggins. Like, it's horrendous. I feel it's like watching a pitcher with the yips, because he knows what to do. He's just not doing it, and he's getting a lot of chances. Like, there was his turnover log in the last series of games, he has 8 field goals and 10 turnovers. Like that, you can't do that as a role player. You just can't. So I'm wondering if there's something there. Josh Green, their 2020 first round draft pick, kind of much maligned by Mavs fans because he wasn't Desmond Bane or Tyrese Maxey or some of the guys that were picked. He's rounded out into a pretty nice player, but the problem is he's a 6'4" shooting guard. No matter what anyone will say, he is not a wing. The Mavericks are just real small. So I think if there's a trade to be made, it's to get some size, because Luka Doncic realistically shouldn't be your second biggest guy on the floor in every matchup. And he usually is most nights.
So based on the expectations and how they've, not the unreasonable ones that Mavericks fans have had. And we just talked about Grant Williams, but the scapegoat of an NBA season, it bounces around a ton. I just had a Lakers person on because we previewed the Lakers game. And it's like anywhere from the coach to the front office to D'Angelo Russell to LeBron. Is there a scapegoat for all of this? Because with what's gone wrong if you can actually say things have gone wrong in Dallas?
To me, things haven't gone as wrong as it feels, because you're 5 games over 500 and you were out of the playoffs last year. This is a step in the right direction. And, game to game, there's they should have some more wins. They've lost some really winnable ones. I would say the game to game scapegoat is almost always head coach Jason Kidd, who his post game quotes are often incredible. He takes no responsibility. He doesn't coach during the game. Watch him next to Thibs. He puts his hands in his pockets and stands there. He never gets into the refs. He never gets into the players. So you feel a lot of times, and this is a bit of a loaded statement, but you can feel like the inmates are running the asylum to a degree, because you'll watch Luka lose his mind, as is the kind of player Luka is. It started to trickle down to the other players. Like Tim Hardaway Jr. has picked up 3 techs in the last couple of weeks. It's like Timmy, old Knicks fans probably have a love-hate relationship with Timmy the way Mavs fans do because he's just such a loose cannon of a player sometimes.
Kind of an apathetic relationship towards Timmy, to be honest. He's
a guy.
He was traded twice. Like, it's tough to actually have a feeling toward him. He's
a guy, and so as a guy, you can't get texts. So it's just sort of bled down to where it feels like there's a little bit of a. And it starts with Mark Cuban, frankly, because he sits there screaming on the sidelines. There's like an institutional lack of composure that kind of plagues this team. And that's partially why they're not better beyond like just the lack of talent. So I would say if there's a scapegoat, it would be just sort of the notion that we need to get to the playoffs. And by putting that as the key goal, you can sometimes develop really bad habits, which I think is an element of what the Mavericks have done on top of the injuries that they've had.
Well, so the end of last season being what it was and how they missed the play-in altogether and were able to, you mentioned tanking. And I will just say as a Knicks fan, as the team currently owns control over the Mavs pick,
sure,
I'm not the Knicks fan that like screamed bloody murder or like this is an outrage. I respected the chess move.
I forgot how mad Knicks fans got about that.
This was turning out to be the perfect season. Like, you know how, because you brought up the 60-point game, like, which I'm sure Mavericks fans view that game as Luka's 60-point triple-double, right? The Knicks blew a 9-point lead in 30 seconds. Like, it's an outcome that's 1 in 14,283, I believe. So you can see I have that number memorized. We were able to spin zone both the first Dallas loss and the second Dallas loss as well. It's going to help us get their pick because we'll have won too many games. And then it ended up being that you ended up with a 10th pick anyway. I guess my question is more about the outcome this season. I know it's a weak draft, but do you personally, and maybe do you speak on behalf of Mavericks fans, that you just want the pick to convey now?
Oh, yeah.
So that way you can get the protections gone and the Porzingis deal is officially done after that?
I think that's right. Mainly just to convey. There's also like the historical implications. My podcast co-host Josh Bowe wrote a piece with like 10 games left that essentially implied, I mean, it didn't imply, it stated players of Luka's historical value, i.e. guys that make multiple all-NBA first teams, do not miss the playoffs at all, period. There are no instances of it with guys that have done it. Luka was the first. So I don't think you can become the first guy to not make the playoffs twice. and as the season wears along, my co-host and I were looking at this recent stretch where the Mavericks were going to play Philadelphia, the Brooklyn, the Knicks. Like there's just like a 3 or 4 game stretch. Oh, and then the Bucks, where it was like, geez, that's a terrible run of games. And then so far they're playing about 500 basketball. So as the year goes on, I think that will end up happening where rough patches of the schedule will become wins, and the Mavericks will probably make the play-in / playoffs just because other teams will kind of give up. Even if this draft is looking at being historically like almost the year 2000 level weird, where there are no good, like not like good players, but there's not anybody that you're like, oh, guess we're going to draft Kenyon Martin, number 1. Exciting, kind of thing. So that's kind of my hope, at least. And, injuries obviously play a big factor. If Luka and Kyrie can't play, 65% of the remaining games together, that's going to be pretty tough. But I'm cautiously optimistic at this point that that'll happen. So that's just sort of where I land.
Well, it's funny you mentioned the schedule breaking right for you and how you went into this little gauntlet, if you want to call it a gauntlet, and like Embiid goes down, so you don't have to play him. I'm not 100% sure Jalen Brunson's going to play in this game on Thursday night. He turned his ankle on Tuesday against the Grizzlies. The Knicks are they're lacking bodies that can walk at the moment. Josh Hart is limping around. Isaiah Hartenstein's playing on a bad Achilles.
Just trying to get to All-Star break kind of thing.
That's the focus. And it's funny because under Tibbs, it's almost as if you have to maximize, like guys just don't sit. Like Julius Randle was an Iron Man. Last year, it was like impossible to get any Knick rotation player to miss a game unless they were legitimately injured. And it was like a long-term thing. Like no guys missed games. And now because of the Anunoby trade, it's almost changed the mindset. It's like, all right, we now know what this looks like when it's healthy and working. So it's this weird shift in like, okay, we can take some load management days if we need to make sure that guys aren't limping into the playoffs.
The Knicks were a fun counterpoint when our show and Mavs Moneyball, the website I run, was complaining about the minute stuff because the Knicks were on the complete opposite end of the spectrum of having multiple lineups with 100 plus possessions and 100 plus minutes and whatnot. Whereas the Mavericks, as recently as 3 games ago, I've not looked at the data in a bit, only had one lineup with more than 100 possessions the entire end of the season. And so that's why, I hate making the injury excuse, but that's where I circle back to, because sometimes the injury bug just bites you at a certain point in the year. Like, no team is like the Memphis Grizzlies, which is bringing in like their bloggers off the street to play basketball for them. Did you see that real small guy that's playing for them?
Yep, last night. And he had a pretty good game, too.
It's pretty good. He blocked Steph Curry. That was it. Anyway.
Yeah.
That's sort of where I am at the moment.
Makes sense. So I go into this next part of the conversation about Luka and like that 60-point triple-double and like what he's averaging 34, 8, and 9 on the season at the moment. And I guess it's kind of loops into the scapegoat conversation, but I've never had a player as good as Luka Doncic, as great as I think Jalen Brunson is, or as great as I thought Carmelo Anthony is. I've never had someone that good play for my team. So in your perspective, how much is missing the playoffs last year and where they stand in the standings this year on him? Or is it really just like he's the only good thing that's like consistently working and consistently available on this team?
I mean, it's really tough because if you're the kind of old school basketball player and fan that looks at how the game ought to be played and says, that guy has the ball too much. You're doing too much. He stands around when he doesn't have the ball, blah, 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 blah. I think that's actually it's a fun argument. But then I ask you to walk through the Mavericks roster with me, and I want you to tell me beyond Kyrie, because Kyrie's been hurt a lot, that, what else, like, who do you want to shoot the ball? Who do you want to make plays? And the Mavericks, by and large, have done an atrocious job building around Luka Doncic. They got Luka and Brunson in one draft. And I think if you were to go through their transactions, you would find as many as 4 out of every 5 was not just bad, but like catastrophic. I mean, Brunson, remember he didn't play in the second Clippers playoff series because Rick Carlisle exiled him and played another former Knick. What the heck was his name?
Trey Burke
over him.
We bring that up a lot out here at Knicks Film School.
And it's just like, what are you doing institutionally to where that is a choice? Trey Burke had no suitors. None. He was not playing on an NBA roster. The Mavericks brought him in for a 10-day to go to the 2020 bubble. And then they signed him to a multi-year deal. He was not getting offers. Willie Cauley-Stein, JaVale McGee, Josh Richardson, some of their big sign, like Christian Wood. Like, what are we doing? Like, I get that Luka is a mercurial, difficult player, but there's an argument to be made that every player that comes in to play with a superstar like that needs to adjust their game to the superstar, just like LeBron James. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that as a kind of a fan and a consumer of the team product, because I want to see wins, but I at least understand the argument. So I think Luka bears a little bit of responsibility in the sense of he acquiesced to head coach Jason Kidd. Yes. He did not put his foot down further about Jalen Brunson. Didn't happen. There's not been a lot of Luka involvement in some of this stuff. He did put his foot in the mix to say, go get Kyrie, because he was exhausted. And I'm just not sure that was the right call. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. And like, especially after like the Brunson of it all, we can just have the Brunson conversation now if you'd like. That being the cardinal sin, it sounds like I'm just getting your vibe right now that's the thing you hold against the franchise the most in the not building around Luka Doncic correctly.
I mean, I think that it's a talent judgment. He's been in your house for 3 years. I understand if you didn't see that he was going to become what he is right now. I think that's completely defensible. But was he a functional, useful player that was going to be a regular rotation starter for years to come if you liked him? Yes. The Mavericks opted not, this is on record from Tim McMahon. Rick Brunson sometimes, I think, sort of bends facts that work to his narrative. That's fine. I don't have a problem with that. But I know for a fact that Jalen Brunson wanted to sign the 4-year, $55 million extension that the Mavericks had available, but never actually offered. And the Mavericks now say, and have been saying, well, we didn't want to offend him with that offer because he's too good. Rewind the clock and you go and look at that year. Kid didn't even start putting him in the starting lineup until January. He was still a sixth man. You can make the argument that I don't think he knew how good he was. That's why he was willing to take that. And so and they didn't want to do it because they wanted to have the flexibility to trade him. He was making like $1.7 million a year. Look at the trade market nowadays. You can't trade anyone that doesn't make at least 8 figures. So small, like low 6-figure or 7-figure guys, you can't do anything with them. So that's just like such a calculated, unbelievably bad misstep. And then everything from there, we know the tampering. I don't even care. Like everybody tampers. The Knicks got caught. Who cares?
I don't. I'm very happy that they tampered personally.
Yeah, it's fine. Like I'm a Kansas City Chiefs fan, and all these people love to tell me it's like, oh, the refs love the Chiefs. You know what I say? It's fantastic.
Yeah. When it works for your team, it actually works.
I don't care. I want to win. So that's sort of where I settle. And with the Brunson situation, it just was when Mark Cuban went on television and said we can offer him more money. By that point, the deal was done. That's embarrassing. Everybody within the Mavericks organization was like, why is he saying this? And it's all a PR war because Mark Cuban would rather kind of be in front of the fans and look like he's doing the right thing than do the right thing. It drives me nuts sometimes.
So then my question is there's an element to this I don't think has ever been really discussed, and maybe we can have the conversation because the 4 for 55 is we noted it because we knew who Jalen Brunson's agent and godfather was. We knew that Rick Brunson was being brought into the staff at some point. Yeah. Right? Like we tracked the not in the starting 5. We saw
you can track it back to when he was drafted because the agent specifically asked Donnie Nelson, do not include that 4th-year provision. Let's just forget and do that as a favor to me. This was that long and drawn out plan. It's brilliant.
I'll go a step further. There's a part of me that wonders if Leon Rose takes the job a year earlier and is part of the negotiations for the Porzingis trade, if instead of Dennis Smith Jr., it's not Jalen Brunson in the trade. That could have been the sliding doors moment there. But the Mavs could have just offered him, especially off that playoff run. Cuban's right. They could have offered him more money and just outbid the Knicks. It would have been seen as an overpay, but you keep him in house. It's just money. You have his bird rights. Is that at all talked about amongst the Mavericks, your audience, or just at all that if you just outbid the Knicks, then yes, it's looked at as a bit of an overpay, but worst case scenario, you still have all your other assets to get a third guy next to Luka.
At what point are we talking over?
His free agency.
See, I don't even know. If I remember everything correctly, they had sort of a walkaway figure that was 4 for 125, something like that. I could be getting the numbers wrong, but it ultimately doesn't matter. But I think if you have a walkaway figure with the way that Rick Brunson had been able to sort of maneuver the Mavericks back into a corner, I don't think you're getting him for anything short of the actual max. That's sort of my just opinion. And
would you have been comfortable with them giving him a max at that point?
At that point in time, I don't think so.
No, okay.
That's just because of asset allocation, not him. It's just if you're paying two guys who aren't in, Brunson's pretty good for defense for his size, but he's still 6 foot tall. So it's you're paying a backcourt that's not great defensively, $11 bajillion. It's hard to build around that.
Yeah.
And also just the usage of it all. I want to say it was on the Kevin O'Connor and was the Mismatch show. They were sort of talking about this, let's just revisit the Brunson thing. And I think it was Chris Vernon who said something, it's you never would have thought that Brunson would go out and score 40 points. And then I think Kevin O'Connor responded to the fact, it's yeah, true, but the Mavericks still have the guy who went and scored 70 points. So if you're having to pick, as much as I love Brunson, because I do, I didn't for a while. It used to drive me crazy. But as much as you love Brunson, you still gotta pick Luka in a one or the other choice. That's just the way, the Knicks. I think Knicks fans do the same thing. That said, I think it's worked out unbelievably well. He's such an important locker room guy. Like, that's probably the most underestimated thing the Mavericks really messed up on beyond, because he brings good vibes all the time. All the time. Like, there's never, and with somebody like Luka who's mercurial, you need that. You need that guy who's just going to lift people up at all times. And like Brunson is an incredible leader, and that's almost as valuable as everything else he's giving the Knicks from a statistical point of view. It's
a leader we haven't had in a long time. And I'm like a big Carmelo Anthony guy. And even I have to admit, like, he more led on the court that everybody knew, like, oh, he's due to get buckets. He's going to be able to be the best offensive player on the court. But all of his teammates just talk about how it was like awesome to play with him and cool to chill with him. It was never like he's going to galvanize this team to, beat LeBron and whoever they were playing in whatever series. I do have to ask about Luka and his future. And I mean, you've painted a picture that they've not built as well as they possibly could around a guy with the ceiling that he has. I know he's like far away from any hint of like free agency or leaving, but like, what's your nervous level at the moment that like they'll never get it right around him and he'll get too frustrated?
Medium. I think with his super, like, whatever you call it, the extension that's after the third contract, I guess.
Let's call it the super duper max.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The numbers on that are beyond insane, to where I want to say the Mavericks can offer $100 million more than any other team. He might not care about money. He might say he doesn't care about money. It's $100 million. A lot of money.
His players union is going to care about that, though. That's right. The thing,
Right. And then you say, okay, well, he could sign and then he could demand a trade elsewhere. We've seen how well that's worked out.
Well, Dame did get to move. I will say that Dame did sign the extension and then move.
But then it becomes such a dollar figure where if he's making like $65 or $70 million a year, I don't know if the NBA teams can actually trade that much, like, in season. I know you can do it in the off season where the rules are a little more relaxed, but in season, don't you have to come within 10% of like the thing? Like, could you imagine coming up with $65 million worth of contracts? That's
I can't see a player that good getting traded in season, to be honest.
Yeah,
it feels like it would be an off season. Like, he signs his extension, and then I don't think I'm creating a complete hypothetical here,
sure,
but it's the legit scenario that happened with Dame, where he signed his extension, the waiver or the ability to trade him then became available a year later or 6 months later, and then the following off season, if that season went poorly, you would then address a trade demand. Then
yeah, and. So from just a logistical point of view, I find it to be very difficult. Now, he has a player option on the end of the current deal, which is where the leverage point comes in for him. And so I think as recently as this summer, he can really start saber rattling, but he shouldn't need to saber rattle. If you're not performing to where you have a shot at the Western Conference Finals with a guy who will make, and I think it's going to happen again this year, I think he's going to make his first all NBA team in a row.
Mm-hmm.
If you're playing with a guy that is that functional, and I know a lot of people can't stand him, but there's no denial of his talent. If you're not able to do something with him, that starts to rest on you as much as it does him. I mean, it's a very silly situation because it seems to have happened with almost every early all NBA player of the last 20 years. LeBron James, Anthony Davis, where you want to hurry up and move the timeline along. If I was to have to do it all over again, and I sort of said this at the time because I was really worried about Kristaps Porzingis' injury history, though I think it's almost understated how well he's bounced back from the absurd number of injuries he's had. I wouldn't have traded for him in 2019 there because they handed the keys to Luka at that point. Kristaps did not understand that Luka was better than him. That was very much obvious, though he came to understand it. And so giving a 19-year-old guy, no matter how talented, the keys to the franchise has come with risks that and challenges that the Mavericks just have never corrected. I mean, Luka's going to be a passionate guy his entire life, but no one can get through to him about this ref bitching stuff. It doesn't even matter if he's right. Like he finished a and one last night that was just a textbook continuation. And NBA referee Mark Davis, who's looking right at it, goes, "No, it's on the floor." And this stuff happens to him throughout the games because they don't like him. And everyone will say, well, referee's supposed to be impartial. Referee's a human being. If you get cursed at, 12 times a year by the same guy over and over, and they know, even if it's another language, they're not stupid. They're going to start to hold that stuff against you. And so he needs to grow up a little bit more, and he needs to take more of an active leadership role, because what he does with his body language, and you'll see this tomorrow night, if the Knicks come out and, punch the Mavericks in the mouth, he drops his head. He doesn't get back on D. Mavericks have one of the worst transition defenses in the league, and the root function is Luka, because he doesn't get back because he's too busy talking. And so there's just a lot that comes with him that you need stronger support around him. You need a better coach. You would have thought a guy like Jason Kidd would get into his ass, and he just doesn't. He went on Dallas radio the other day and talked about how he thinks Luka could be one of the best players of all time. Why are you kissing his rear like that? Even if it's true, which I'm not sure it is, but even if it's true, what does that get you? Do you think he cares that you're kissing his butt in public? He wants to win basketball games. And Kidd is just not a great coach. The Mavericks GM is a former shoe executive, and the owner is Mark Cuban, and everybody has their opinions about Mark Cuban, and whatever your opinion is, there's probably some truth to it.
You're painting a picture of a scenario that's not conducive to eventually build something around him. I will say from my objective perspective here.
I mean, they finally did something smart where they drafted a functional player and got lucky with Derek Lively. But the Mavericks front office, for the better part of my time as a Mavericks fan, going back to even Dirk Nowitzki, was built through free agency. And I just don't think you've got to have a mix. And the Mavericks have had some luck drafting the last several years, because I do think there's more to it than luck. You can see some of the best franchises that we have right now that have done a good job by drafting, your Oklahoma City Thunder. It's to a certain extent, even your Golden State Warriors, even though I'm sure their fans are like sick of some of their younger players. You gotta build. You can't always acquire, because you can have these best laid plans, and most of the time they don't come to fruition because there's 30 other teams also planning. Just sort of drives me nuts.
Yeah. And look, the Knicks I'm not even putting the Luka to the Knicks thing out there, because I don't think that's a realistic scenario at the moment. Maybe in a couple of years we can do another podcast and have that conversation. But as far as this matchup is concerned on Thursday night, you mentioned the Mavericks being on a New York road trip between playing Little Brother on Tuesday night, now coming into the Garden on Thursday. As I mentioned, the Knicks are extremely banged up, and it may benefit the Mavericks. I was looking through some of the lineup data, and the Luka Kyrie tandem is off the charts offensively. If Brunson doesn't play, you're not even sweating this game, right?
Probably anyway, just because they're still very 3-point dependent. The Mavericks are never really out of a game because they're so 3-point dependent, but sometimes they're also never far enough ahead. They were beating Brooklyn by 26 last night, and it got down to a 6-point game at one point in time. That's just sort of the way the Mavericks play. The secret matchup that no one will ever talk about other than me is the fact that Luka Doncic on the road with time to go out and nightlife is a dangerous ass. It's a dangerous pairing, flat out. He has a newborn baby at home, about 2 months old. So I've seen him at some Mavs games where he just granted, millionaire, he probably has help, whatever, but you still have a 2-month-old baby at home, which is I have a 3-month-old right now. It is taxing. You sort of lose your mind sometimes. So Luka out on the road, where he's no longer having to be Daddy Luka, wouldn't shock me if he lets loose a little bit in some of these other towns. And you can just tell from the opening tip. You watch his body language. Frankly, you watch his face coloring. We used to have it's not near as bad as it used to be, but the first 2 years, you could tell pink face Luka was a guy that had a good time the night before. It doesn't happen near as much now because he's 24. He's been going out professionally since he was 16, but I think he's finally figured out that it does, yes, impact his performance. So, is New York nightlife undefeated? That's kind of the matchup that I would want to hang out there.
we've seen a couple of schedule losses like that. They recently beat Denver on the end of a road trip where they beat them by like 40 points. And it was like everybody healthy. Jokic went off, but nobody else did. They beat Utah last week, and it was the second night of a back-to-back for Utah, the first night being in Brooklyn. So look, if Brunson doesn't play, I don't like the Knicks' chances. I will say that there's just a characteristic of this Thibodeau team is no matter who's in the game, they're going to play hard, and you're going to have to like there's as much as lack of talent may come into play, and just the Mavericks having the two best players and maybe the three best players on the floor. I would hope that you know what, I'll send Luka some dinner reservations or recommendations tonight if I have to. Like, hey, check out this place in the West Village. Why not? And let's go check a movie out in Lincoln Center. Why, like, Luka, it's on me. Even, you know, we'll make sure that you enjoy New York as much as possible. Although it technically would make sure it's on him with the salary that he makes. Speaking of the Knicks, just your outsider or your far-away perspective of what's going on with the Knicks. So 33-18, made the Anunoby trade. Like, what was your reaction when they made the Anunoby trade and then saw what it did to their team?
I was a little surprised because Anunoby is one of those guys that I didn't properly value. And so seeing him in a very different context has forced me to reevaluate all my priors. And the fact that he seems like much more of a finishing touch piece to a team that is probably much closer to true title contention than I would have really understood. I've watched, your coach for years. I actually sat next to him in a summer league game the first time I went in 2018, and just I have on my phone, I have some video of him yelling and like just his incredible voice. And so it's, I was skeptical of a Thibodeau coach team being able to play in the current NBA just because he's such a grinder. And so it's really fascinating and interesting to see that he's built, and the Knicks have built him a team of guys that work with his philosophy and also the modern NBA, which is fascinating. And, one of the things that Mavs fans probably don't realize, like Mitchell Robinson's out for forever. And so what happens when you add him back into the mix? There's just a lot of signs pointing north for the Knicks in the right way, which has got to be really, it's got to be really exciting and really fun, because when you suffer for a really, really long time, which I frankly never have as a Mavs fan, you deserve that. You deserve that. You deserve your faith being rewarded every great now and again. So it's got to be a lot of fun on that end of things. I think the Knicks are kind of an easy team to root for, maybe in no small part because the superstar element in the team is just more likable. Like I have like a blood oath against Joel Embiid and the Boston Celtics, and so it's nice. Like the Knicks are probably more fun to root for me than any other Eastern Conference team.
They're doing all of this without a max contract on their roster,
which is pretty incredible. Yeah,
it's a bunch of underdogs. It's guys that, like, we've obviously documented how Brunson ended up on the Knicks, but Julius Randle, who won't play in this game because of a dislocated shoulder, but the guy was just like released by the Lakers to, like, you're free to, like, we're just waiving our rights to your second rookie contract. Like, you're on a rookie contract, you're gone. Like, we just want to make as much room as possible to sign LeBron James. He then goes to New Orleans and plays with LeBron's teammate for a season, or LeBron's new teammate for a season with Anthony Davis. And then they just let him walk after they draft Zion Williamson, and he was the consolation prize to, as you remember, the Knicks traded Porzingis because they were going to get Zion and Kyrie and KD, and he ended up with Julius Randle. And 3 All-Star teams and 2 All-NBA teams later, he's more than outperformed his contract. So I think the way that they're signing like role players like Hartenstein and DiVincenzo, and even like Precious Achiuwa, this thing has been so weird that he was a throw-in in the Anunoby trade, and now he's like starting games and being
he's actually quite good. Yeah,
contributing. Like, he grabbed 16 rebounds in a game last week. It's actually pretty insane. Last thing before you get out of here, I like to wrap up with getting your perspective on rivalries. So I call it the Mount Rushmore of rivals, the 4 teams that you look forward to playing on the NBA calendar. That, like, whether it's historical and the rivalry goes back far, or whether it's a new rivalry that's brewed, who are the 4 teams that you consider the Mount Rushmore of Mavericks rivals?
I would say 5 years ago, 10 years ago, the teams would be very different. Just because, the Mavericks and Spurs just have a historical, Dirk Duncan, with Duncan winning most of those. But that's not really the same as what we're talking about now. Like, nowadays, I really look forward to playing, like, the number 1 team has to be the Phoenix Suns. Luka and Devin Booker, like, genuinely do not like each other. I mean, I think they're probably cool in locker rooms and all-star stuff, but like they get very close to physicality when they play each other. And the Mavericks have won just enough of those games to where I think it's but the Suns have also won enough to where I think it's a true rivalry game. I also would really put the Nuggets up there just because they're sort of the Western Conference measuring stick for very obvious reasons. But I also like seeing like the styles make fights of Luka Doncic versus Jokic, because despite their being from, similar part of the world and everybody always tying them together because they're both from that part of the world, they play basketball so very differently. That's probably like my top two. I also really like, this is an odd one, but this goes back to the bubble. Whenever the Dallas Mavericks play the Milwaukee Bucks, the basketball games are just fantastic. Luka and Giannis seem to have a very friendly, that almost turned nasty a couple games ago because Giannis kicked Luka in the stomach on one of his wild bullshit body plays.
I saw that.
It looks like the Stone Cold getting ready to set up to do the stunner. I was really hoping that Giannis would do that.
It's great imagery, by the way. You painted that picture really well, and it's very accurate.
And then that one's probably up there for me. And then it's just because it's the Luka era versus the Dirk Nowitzki era, I always really get a kick out of playing the Atlanta Hawks. Just because I had to deal with their fans for the better part of 3 years trying to act like there was any sort of comparison between Trey and Luka, and there's not. And then Luka scored 73 points.
I was going to say, I bet the 73-point game was pretty sweet. It was kind of a nail in that coffin, right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Even though the Mavericks won that game, right?
Yes, but they needed every single stinking point.
Okay, just making sure. I knew that there was a string of games where guys scored Cat scored 62
and lost,
and then Booker scored 60 plus and lost. Steph just scored 60 plus and but the Mavericks won the game that Luka scored 70 plus.
Yeah.
Well, listen, as someone who found himself in a weird 2-year rivalry with the Hawks because of one playoff series that Julius Randle just was not able to be the number one guy. I just it was like a house of cards that he was keeping up afloat all season. And then in one playoff series, they were like, let's just stop him. And then the whole thing collapsed.
Isn't that one playoff series primarily responsible for why Julius Randolph's career playoff numbers look like he is a corpse?
Look like the way they do. Yeah, he shot 27% in that series. Yeah.
That's it was so hard to do.
Right. And he was the highest volume guy. But the thing is, Kirk, he was he was successful at every single shot that he was given in that series or forced to take. He made that all season. That blueprint worked for all 72 games of that COVID shortened season. And then in one playoff series, shot 6 for 24 in game one, and he never regained any hint of form. And what's funny is I remember that series so vividly that in game one, hit his first 3, and it was Randall's going off for 35 tonight. And you know what's even crazier? He averaged 38 points a game in his 3 matchups against the Hawks that year, too. So it was very much this is a team he could take care of. He's historically taken care of until the playoffs happen. So, yeah. Well, Kirk, thank you so much for joining me today. I look forward to this matchup. Almost solely because it may end up being the whoever's left of the Knicks playing against Luka, and I can just kind of watch it without expectations and see if Luka can get 60 in the Garden. But maybe Jalen Brunson will play against his old team.
He will.
Yeah, I think has not beaten his old team since the
which is really funny because it was the reverse when the Mavericks traded for Porzingis. Dallas could not win any of those matchups. I think it was 4 games in a row that were just disgusting. Where I was that was where I really grew to be frustrated by KP. But that should be a fun game. I'm looking forward to it. And it also, I so love the early TNT game because it means when we're done covering the game, I get to go to bed before 2 a.m. It's nice.
Yeah, it's all the same for us here in New York, where the game ends around 9:30, 10 o'clock, and then we're doing a post game for an hour and a half, 2 hours. It's the West Coast. It's actually the Dallas game in Dallas where it's this is a 9 o'clock start that we have
those
to.
Those are brutal. The worst.
Yeah. The West Coast trips mean a lot worse to us for sure.
So terrible. I did when I lived in Washington, D.C. for several years, and I don't know how I did this. Just covering the West Coast games. This is awful. So it's nice. It's nice when games start at human being times.
Man, those time zones, especially the West Coast time zones, are the ones I get up for. I went to Vegas for a conference in college, and it was like during the NBA playoffs, and I was like, oh, it's 3:00 and there's an NBA game going. I know, that's interesting. This is new. I like this. Kirk, before you get out of here, plug what you'd like to plug for all the fine folks at home.
You can find our podcast, Pod Maverick. It's on all various podcast platforms. We're on YouTube. We go live after every game, just because I frankly find it easier to record live than to edit.
Sneaky secret about going live. There's no video editing.
Just plug it out there.
It's all there.
All your fuck ups are out there. And then I also run MavsMoneyball.com, which is a SB Nation based website, and along the lines of like posting and toasting. And so we we do our work waxes and wanes because most of us are like lightly compensated volunteers, but it's fun. Trade deadline stuff. We got a lot of stuff up now if you're interested at all in the Mavericks, and you want to see a screed of a game recap if the Mavericks lose to the Knicks, that could be fun for everybody. But yeah, thanks so much for having me on.
Of course. Thank you, Kirk.